Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, and we're grateful you're here. I'm Allison Feldman, CEO of the Lewy Body Dementia Association. On behalf of LBDA, thank you for joining us today to learn more about our upcoming externally led patient-focused drug development meeting on dementia with Lewy bodies and how you can make your voice heard. The externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, or EL-PFDD, is a unique opportunity to inform the U.S. Food and Drug Administration about the impact of living with dementia with Lewy bodies. Whether you have DLB, are a current or a former care partner, or a family member, lending your voice will inform the context in which regulatory decisions are made and improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline. It doesn't matter where you live or where you are on your journey. This is your time to tell your story to the FDA, medical product developers, and other key stakeholders and decision makers, to tell them what it's like to live with DLB, how it impacts your life, and what meaningful treatments would look like to you. Before we get started, I have just a few notes about today's webinar. We'll be sharing a lot of information, but don't worry, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to watch again in about a week. We'll send you an email with a link to our webinar on our YouTube channel. Please also feel free to share that with family, friends, and care partners. You will be muted during the presentation. If you'd like to enter a question, you can do that in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which will appear when you roll your cursor over that area. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. We'll not be able to answer questions about medical products or give medical advice in this webinar. We will answer questions related to the general FDA process and the meeting on October 15th. You might be wondering why LBDA is hosting the EL-PFDD meeting. Because safe and effective drugs are urgently needed to treat DLB and improve quality of life. The patient and care partner voice is critical in helping the FDA understand what symptoms matter most, the impact of DLB on your daily life, and what your experiences with current treatments have been. We can't do this alone, so we are bringing the community together on October 15th. And speaking of not doing this alone, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Larry Bauer and James Valentine from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, experts in EL-PFDD meetings. Larry Bauer provides counsel to drug manufacturers on a wide range of regulatory topics, drug development regulatory strategy, and drafting policies and procedures. He has extensive experience in patient advocacy and expertise in the planning and execution of EL-PFDD meetings. James Valentine assists medical product industry and patient advocacy organizations in a wide range of regulatory matters, including new drug development and approval. Previously, he worked for the FDA's Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, facilitating patient input and serving as liaison to key stakeholders on regulatory policy issues. And finally, I would like to thank our collaborative partner, the Alzheimer's Association, and our sponsors, GE Healthcare, Lilly, Acadia Pharmaceuticals, and ASI for their generous support. And our thanks also goes out to our promotional partners, Lewy Body Canada, the Lewy Body Dementia Resource Center, Lewy Body España, Lewy Body Ireland, the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, and the Susan and Charles Berghoff Foundation. And now, Larry and James will tell you more about the EL-PFDD and how you can participate.
Thank you so much for the introductions, Allison, and it's great to be here with this community today as we're gearing up for your externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. I'm James Valentine. I'll be presenting first before my colleague Larry Bauer. So we can go to the next slide. You'll see here that what we plan to cover with you today is we want to first start giving you some background about the Food and Drug Administration and how medical products and drugs are developed. It's very important to understand kind of the process that we're trying to help inform through this meeting. We recognize this might be a refresher for some of you, but we want to make sure everyone has that information. After that, we'll talk a little bit about how your voices as people living with the condition and care partners play a role in that drug development and FDA decision-making process, and then spend the rest of the remainder of our time together talking very specifically about this PFDD meeting, how you'll be able to participate, and give you some tips for doing so. So if we can go to our next slide, I'm going to start us off with that background information about FDA and drug development. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us step by step through the process of how we get from research and starting to develop drugs through the point of a drug being approved and available for you and your doctors to make decisions about whether or not to try that drug once it's approved and on the market. So we're going to start from the very beginning stages here. The very first stage is drug discovery. And so this is a stage where we're doing basic science research. This is the type of research that's done by the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, and at academic research centers all around the world, where we're getting new insights into the disease process. That helps us better understand where we might be able to intervene in the disease process, either downstream or even really at the root cause of the disease. And so by doing that type of research and having that understanding, we can then begin to test potential drug treatments to see if they might help treat that disease or condition. This might involve testing existing products that exist. We call this repurposing, or using new technologies. There's a lot of new targeted technologies, and as medical science advances, we'll continue to have more of those where we can actually design a compound to target this specific disease. So once that happens and we have a promising compound that we think aligns with, at a biological level, with being able to help impact the understood path of the disease, we can then move into testing that product. And so the first of those steps, and you'll see those across the bottom of the slide here, the first of these steps is preclinical development. Preclinical meaning before we go into the clinic or before we start testing in humans. And so preclinical work is really important because it helps us understand if a product is reasonably safe for initial use in humans, as well as having some information about its effectiveness in treating the disease target through different models of the disease, whether that's an assay or an animal model, where the animal is modified in a way to replicate the human condition. And so we take these investigational or research compounds and test them in these two different types of studies. The safety studies are often referred to as toxicology studies. The looking at the drug effect is called a pharmacology study. And once we feel like we have sufficient information that this is both sufficiently effective, reasonably safe, and we can even begin to pick doses of that product that meet those parameters, that information can then be taken to the FDA in what's called an investigational new drug application, or IND. That's the application that allows and grants permission for a product to be studied in people. And so that IND submission includes all of that information about those pharmacology and toxicology studies. There's a third important prong to this, which is the drug's quality. We always want to make sure that if a person is receiving a drug, we know what's in that compound that's being administered. Not only we want to make sure that there's the right amount of the actual active drug compound, but there's other ingredients, fillers and things like that. We want to make sure that's produced in a high quality way, that there's not impurities that might be harmful. And so manufacturing information is also provided to the FDA to help them assess the product's quality. The IND will also include what's called a clinical trial protocol and other investigator information. The protocol is a document that describes the clinical study and how it's going to be conducted. And so that plan is provided to FDA, so FDA can assess whether the safety, effectiveness, and quality or manufacturing information supports that specific clinical trial that's being proposed. Typically, the trial that would be proposed is what's called a phase 1 clinical trial. Phase 1 is the smallest and shortest duration type of study. It may be single doses of a product, even if it's a product intended to be used, chronically, for very long or even lifetime by a patient. And we may be also often escalating the doses from very low doses to higher doses. This allows us to see what some of those most common side effects are, especially as we go to higher doses where you might expect that, with a higher dose, there might be more safety signals. We also, though, at the same time, can begin to see in people where the drug gets to, how long it stays there, how it's metabolized by the body, and how long or how it's excreted from the body. And so that tells us, is the drug getting to the right places in the body? It needs to have its effect, and helps us understand more about the dosing of the product, to inform what we then will take into later stage trials. After phase 1, again, assuming that we have a drug that continues to be safe, and we have information to let us know that we have doses that we expect are going to be able to get to where they need to be to have that effect, we can go into phase 2 clinical trials. And so phase 2 trials are a little larger and a little longer. Because they're a little bit longer, we can start to assess a drug's benefit or its effectiveness. In doing that, we usually call phase 2 studies proof of concept studies, because it's our first time to actually see early markers of whether a drug is having the intended effect. This is our first time where we are for sure studying the drug in people with the particular disease or condition. Phase 1 can sometimes be done in healthy volunteers, meaning people without the particular disease or condition. We can still assess safety and metabolism. But in phase 2, because we're looking at effectiveness now, we need to be studying it in people who have the disease or condition. A lot of the times, phase 2 studies will include control groups, the most common being a placebo control. This is kind of the sugar pill as we think of it, so we want people to not know whether they're on drug or not. So that way, we can really understand, sometimes people knowing that they're on a drug has that what we call placebo effect, meaning that they may perform better on different measures in the clinical trials, because they either know or don't know that they're on a drug or not. When you have a placebo group, you eliminate that type of bias. So in these studies, we are always throughout development looking at safety. We get to see now with a little bit longer of dosing whether there's any additional side effects that pop up. And again, we're always assessing the benefits and risks of the product to make sure that we have a product that warrants going forward into development, because as you're seeing, each stage we're going to more and more people for longer. And so that does take us to phase 3. Phase 3 is trials are sometimes called pivotal trials or registration trials. These are the trials that are really designed to help demonstrate the drug's benefit. So these are larger scale, against usually randomized placebo-controlled, but not always. And in this type of study, we get to now really assess effectiveness. So we make sure there's enough people and we're studying for a long enough period of time, based off of whatever the drug is intended to do. We want to make sure we're following people long enough to give the drug a chance to actually show that benefit. So, sometimes, based off of the treatment effect, it might take a long time. And so a study could be, a year, sometimes in extreme cases, 2 years to assess the drug's benefit. But that's helpful. We, compared to phase 2, get to see not only what the initial effect of the drug is, but how long any drug effect is sustained. That's the duration or the durability of that effect. And because these studies are larger, we can start to look at the different groups within the study. How does the drug affect people at different ages or different baseline disease severity over men versus women? And so we can begin to look at that in a rare disease population. We're not expecting to, be able to, draw concrete conclusions, but it still helps us, kind of more qualitatively, assess those differences. And even into phase 3, we may still be evaluating different doses. Hopefully by this point we've narrowed it down to, a couple, key doses that we think gives the best chance of drug benefit while avoiding serious safety risks. As with all of these studies, and even importantly into phase 3, we're doing safety evaluation. And phase 3 studies tend to somewhat more reflect the real world population of patients taking the product. And so they may be taking other medications for their condition, and we can assess how the drug works and drug-drug interactions. So in doing drug development, much of the time does follow this exact phase 1 into phase 2, then phase 3 studies. However, when we're using drugs that maybe have already been approved or studied in other indications or diseases, for other reasons, including the urgency and serious need for treatments, sometimes those things are combined. We might see a phase 1-2 combined study or a phase 2/3 combined study. Also, typically FDA would require 2 phase 3 trials, but in a lot of scenarios where it's a rare, serious disease with an unmet need, FDA may only require a single phase 3 study to be able to review and determine whether the drug is worthy of approval. So when we get to that stage, we've completed the drug's development. The drug developer will hold what's called a pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting. NDA stands for New Drug Application. BLA is Biologics License Application. Which application it is depends on whether you fall under FDA's definition of a drug versus a biologic. Example of a biologic would be like a cell or gene therapy, whereas a small molecule chemical, which is many drugs that we're familiar with, fall under NDAs. The requirements are essentially the same between the two. And so the company will go in and hold that meeting, pre-NDA, pre-BLA meeting, before the submission of that application. The idea is to put the top line information in front of FDA. Here's our pivotal clinical trials. Here's the way we've analyzed those studies. Here's the data. The goal is to, before we get to doing all the work to submit an application, see if there's any major unresolved issues. So after this meeting, there may be additional work that needs to be done, or it may be appropriate to go straight ahead into submitting an NDA or BLA to FDA. That NDA or BLA contains all of the information we've talked about, everything from those animal and other non-clinical experiments, all of the human data from clinical trials. So it's a comprehensive and very large, now electronic package that goes to FDA for their review. So when FDA gets that package, they have to determine whether the application is complete. If not, they can actually stop the application in its tracks by refusing to file and review the application. But if they do accept it, they will assign a review team. And then over the course of either 6 months or 10 months, depending on which type of review the product is granted, either a priority or a standard review. So it's, but either way, it's many months that FDA is given to have their review team assess the drug's benefits. So has effectiveness been demonstrated? The drug's safety, do the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks? And as we've been talking about from the beginning, also assessing the drug quality. And that even includes doing an inspection of the manufacturing facility to ensure drug quality as part of this review. Now, while FDA is doing its review, it may determine it needs outside input or expertise to help think through some of the complex scientific issues. And so FDA has the ability to choose whether it wants to convene what's called an advisory committee. You may have heard about these panels that vote and provide advice to FDA. At the end of the day, it really is just advice. It's still FDA's decision. So even if a vote is in support of approving the drug or against approving the drug, FDA is really listening to all of the input and thoughtful discussion throughout the day, takes that back and really has to still make their own determination. Assuming a drug gets approved, the job of all does not stop there. Once a drug's on the market, a key piece of the work that happens is post-market safety surveillance. This just means that we're monitoring. When a drug is studied in clinical trials, it's a very controlled setting. There's a lot of inclusion, exclusion criteria of who can be in studies. Well, in the real world, a wider range of people and many, many more people are using the product for the first time. So we're going to learn more about how the product behaves in that broader population. And primarily, we want to make sure that the safety profile is understood and the benefits continue to outweigh the risks of the product across that broader population. So I've now kind of very quickly gone through how drugs make it all the way from doing basic science research all the way to your doctor's offices to be prescribed. So let's just talk for a couple of minutes about FDA's role in all of this. So during this whole process of the drugs being developed and clinical trials being conducted, it's important to know that FDA is not the one actually developing drugs. It's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, even sometimes nonprofit groups who are doing this disease research and drug development. FDA is advising, those parties along the way, but ultimately it's up to those, entities, researchers and companies primarily, to decide when and what to study the drugs that they've discovered. FDA is also, once there is a plan for a clinical trial that's proposed to them, they're not the ones actually running those studies. They're not on site during the studies. It really is the researchers, either themselves or hired by the pharmaceutical companies, that are conducting those studies. But each of those different studies that we talked about, those study plans, those protocols are submitted to FDA. So there is some FDA oversight into what studies are conducted, but it's really the researchers and the companies that have to propose those studies to FDA. Once a drug is on the market, let's talk a little bit about where FDA fits in. It's important to know that FDA does not have the ability to regulate the practice of medicine. So what this means is, FDA, they're regulating the companies and researchers that are doing clinical trials and developing drugs. And once they're approved, they regulate what can be said, the marketing of those drugs. But in terms of what happens in the doctor's office between the doctor and the patient, that's outside of FDA's purview. And doctors, as many of you may know, are permitted to prescribe drugs for what is called off-label uses, whether that's a disease that's been approved, but it's a different population, maybe older or younger patients, or maybe a completely different disease that the drug isn't approved for. And that's at within the practice of medicine for doctors to determine. In terms of access, FDA does not regulate the price of medicine. They don't have that information as part of their review. And even if they did, it's not part of their mandate. So they're not allowed to consider that. So they're not doing a cost benefit analysis. They're weighing the direct benefits on treating the disease against the direct risk to the patients. So I talked a good amount about what FDA doesn't do. So let's focus a little bit on what they actually do as part of drug development. So part of their mission is not just to protect the public health, but to help promote it. And as you can imagine, FDA reviewers, they're experts in drug development and clinical trials. They're seeing everything that's being done, a lot, of which is not public information. So they have a lot of insights into what works well, what doesn't work. And so they get to provide their technical expertise to researchers and drug developers. On that little timeline I showed of all the different stages of drug development, I could have put a bunch of little marks across it to show the different meetings that companies and researchers have with FDA. So there really is interaction throughout all of that product development. where FDA gets to help weigh in and give direction of what its best recommendations are. So we hope that this provides some good foundation into the FDA and drug development. Again, it's good to know the process that we're hoping to influence through this meeting, and so we wanted to give you that background. If you want more information, there's great resources on FDA's website, which is listed on this slide, www.fda.gov/for-patients. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Larry Bauer, who's now going to talk about your role in that process.
Thanks so much, James. We're going to shift gears a little bit here. James has just given you a great overview of the drug development process and how FDA is involved in that process. Now I'm going to talk especially about the meeting that we are preparing for. Next slide, please. So just to review again what the purpose of our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting is. So the FDA, as they were reviewing the drugs in the ways that James just talked about, they wanted to develop a more systematic way to gather the patient and caregiver perspective about the conditions that they were reviewing for these new drugs and possible new treatment options. You know, they would just get little bits and pieces hearing from patients and caregivers, but they wanted to get more information. This kind of information can really help them to inform their understanding about the potential benefits and the risks of a new drug that's being developed and their decision about whether or not to approve a new drug. And patient input really helps the FDA during the development, all along the development process, as well as their final review of an application for marketing a new drug. Next slide. So I just mentioned something called a benefit risk assessment. So every new drug that comes to the FDA has to be reviewed. It's the last step before that drug can show up in a pharmacy where your doctor or nurse practitioner can write a prescription and you're able to get access to it. So the FDA is really the last stop before a drug gets approved. And the staff at the FDA have been tasked with trying to evaluate, do the potential benefits of this new drug outweigh the potential risks? So they've developed this benefit risk assessment. It's a formal way of doing such a thing. And what they need to do is these different steps here. So they have to analyze the condition. What is the disease? How many people does it affect? Are there different stages to the disease? They also want to know what are the current treatment options. So for people that have been diagnosed with this disease, are there other drugs available? How well do those drugs treat some of the most important symptoms of the disease? Or is there an unmet medical need? So that's the kind of information that they're going to get from our meeting. We are going to help them understand those things about dementia with Lewy bodies. And then these last three things, the benefits, the risks, and the risk management, that all comes from analyzing the clinical trial data. So James had said that when they submit their new drug application, they have to submit all of the data that they've collected, all of the benefits that they saw, as well as all the side effects that they saw, and then the FDA will evaluate all of that package. Next slide. So we are planning a dementia with Lewy body externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. And you say, why do they keep saying externally led? Well, the reason is that FDA started doing these meetings and they called them PFDD meetings. And then they turned it over to advocacy organizations to continue the work of doing these meetings. So that's why it's external. It's external to the FDA. But the FDA will be in the audience. So we are modeling the meeting that we're planning on some of the discussion questions that came from the FDA. We've really developed an agenda and some panel questions to try to help communicate the most important information related to DLB. And as the FDA's been meeting with us once a month to help us plan the meeting. And during those meetings, they've really emphasized that active patient and caregiver involvement and participation in the meeting is the key to the success of these meetings. That's why we're having our community webinar today. Next slide. So a question that often comes up, what is the outcome of this meeting? So our meeting, I'll give you some, in just a minute here, I'll give you some very specific information about when the meeting is and how you can attend. But after the meeting is done, basically we're going to spend the entire day listening to and learning from people whose lives have been affected by DLB. At the end of this meeting, we are going to write up everything that we heard into a report, which is going to be called the Voice of the Patient Report. This is a summary of the testimony that we've heard. It's also going to include the responses from live polling, which we'll do on our cell phones on the day of the meeting, as well as any written comments that were submitted. This document, the Voice of the Patient Report, is a key communication to the FDA review staff, as well as to drug developers that might be tuning in on the day of the meeting. It's an opportunity for them to learn what is most important for a new treatment for DLB. So from the perspective of people living with it and their caregivers, what would be most important to you? And FDA really wants this information. It helps inform them about ways that meaningful treatments for DLB can be developed and then approved. Next slide. So here's the nitty-gritty. How do you participate in the meeting? Next slide. Okay, so first of all, who is the meeting for? Of course, it's for DLB patients, people living with DLB and their caregivers. We hope as many FDA staff will attend. The FDA is helping us get the word out about the meeting. We might have representatives from pharma and biotech companies who are developing new drugs. But this is an open public meeting, and anyone interested in learning about DLB is welcome to attend. So please share the link with family members, friends, coworkers, anyone that you think might want to learn about DLB. As I said, the meeting is a one-day meeting on October 15th. We'll start at 10 a.m. and go to 3:00 p.m. in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, with a half-hour break for lunch, midday. The meeting is virtual, so people can attend from anywhere. Lately, we've been getting people from all over the world actually attending our meetings, which is awesome. And to access the interactive live stream, this is the URL at the bottom of the page, which you can also find on the LBDA website related to the meeting. Next slide. So just to go over the agenda, this is what's going to happen on the day of the meeting. We'll kick off the meeting with a welcome and some introductory comments from the Lewy Body Dementia Association, which will be followed by a short presentation from one of the staff at the FDA to help to share with us about why these meetings are important to them. Then we'll have a brief clinical background by an expert, an expert physician on DLB. And then this will follow with the important part of the meeting, an interactive discussion, which will be broken into two topics. So in the morning, our overarching topic is DLB symptoms and effects on your life. So we're going to really want to know about, what is it like to have DLB? What kind of symptoms do you experience? I'm going to go over some of the questions we'll be talking about in just a minute here. And then in the afternoon, when we come back from lunch, we're going to have a short presentation, once again, from an expert about currently available treatments. And then the whole rest of the afternoon will be focused on treatments and how do you manage symptoms? What would you like to see in a future treatment if a new treatment was being developed? We'd like to know about what are, some downsides, what's working, what's not working. And then there'll be some a summary and some closing comments at the end. And during each of these sessions, the morning and the afternoon, we're going to have some pre-recorded patient and caregiver panel statements. We will have some live polling, as well as a moderated discussion with the audience, who is you. And there'll be information on the day of the meeting with the phone number at the top of your screen, how you can call in to participate. Next slide. So what are some of the questions that we'll be discussing? So as I mentioned, in the morning, we're going to be focused on symptoms of DLB and the daily impact. So some of the topics we'll be asking you are, of all the symptoms of DLB, maybe which 1 to 3 symptoms have had the most significant impact on either your or your loved one's life? We'd like to know, how does DLB affect you or your loved one on your best days and worst days? And maybe describe a best day or a worst day. So, when you're having one of your better days, what does that look like? And then when you're having a really hard day, what is that like? What are your symptoms like on that day? And then also, we want to hear about the impacts. So are there specific activities that are important to you that maybe you or your loved one cannot do at all, or maybe as fully as you would like because of having DLB? Next slide. We also want to know how your symptoms have changed over time. Maybe what you experienced at the beginning, maybe even before you're diagnosed. How did that change over time to where you are today? And how has your ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? We know that having a disease like DLB also has, emotional impacts. We want to hear, what are those impacts? What are your worries? Do you have anxiety, depression related to this diagnosis? And what do you fear the most as either you or your loved one gets older? So what are your fears for the future? What worries you about having DLB, and what frustrates you the most about having DLB? Next slide. And then in the afternoon, as I said, we're going to switch gears and talk to challenges with treating DLB. So some of the questions that'll be posed in the afternoon are, what are you currently doing to manage DLB symptoms? This can include both medications that are prescribed by a doctor. They could either be on label or possibly off label uses. It could even be things like, I tried CBD, or I tried massage, or I tried aqua therapy. Anything that you're doing, we'd like to hear about. And we want to also learn, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of your DLB? We also want to hear, what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your daily life? Downsides could be a side effect, or maybe how often you have to take the medication, or maybe even some things you have to go to a hospital to get the medication. And then finally, short of a complete cure, which we know everybody would like to see a complete cure for DLB, what specific things would you look for in an ideal new treatment for DLB? Next slide. So our discussion format, which I spoke about a little bit about before, there will be a panel of patients and caregivers for each of those two topics. These people have pre-recorded statements, so it'll be like watching almost like a news show about DLB. The purpose of these pre-recorded statements was to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. We chose panelists to try to reflect a range of experiences with the condition, people at different stages, that kind of thing. And then the patients and caregivers in the audience and online will have a chance to answer polling questions. These are done on your telephone. It's very low tech, and we'll give you instructions on the day of the meeting. And the purpose of polling is to be a starting off point to have more discussion. You use a browser on your cell phone or your tablet, and like I said, the information will be on your screen on the day of the meeting. After we do some polling, then there'll be a discussion with the audience. My colleague James is going to be the moderator that day. So he will be asking questions, and people will either be able to call in. We're also going to have several people that'll be live on a Zoom call, and we'll be talking with them to learn about their experience. We also invite you to submit comments in writing, and you can do that on the website in advance of the meeting, as well as for 30 days after the meeting. So a few tips for effective participation. You can join the meeting and participate in live polling. You can call in, and you can also submit comments via email. Please, as you're participating, remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting, which is to learn about DLB. Kind of think back on some of those topics that James mentioned that the FDA is not involved in, things like insurance and drug pricing. Review these questions in advance, the questions that I just presented. And if you have something important to share, try to relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question. And please pick up your phone and call in. We need all of you to participate. And it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that someone else might have already mentioned that's similar to your own. But if you do call in, try to give it a personal or unique perspective. We ask that when you call in, keep your comments concise and focused. We want to hear from as many people as possible about this highly emotional topic. And just a reminder again, you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. So if something comes to mind that you thought about later after thinking about the meeting, go ahead and write that in as a written comment. Next slide. So to participate in the discussion, you'll tune in remotely. It's by webcast. To register for the meeting, please go to the URL on the bullet below here. Registration opens the week of September 16th, but do put the save the date on your calendar today. So this is just a reminder, it's October 15th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And as I mentioned, comments with answer to the questions can be submitted prior to the meeting or up to 30 days afterwards. And if you do submit a written comment, we will include those in the Voice of the Patient report, which will be submitted to the FDA. Next slide. So in summary, this meeting is your opportunity to be part of the process of having a meaningful impact on clinical trials for DLB, on the design of those trials, as well as new drug development for DLB. Your voices, they must be heard at the beginning of the drug development process, to help companies design trials that meet your needs, and to help the FDA assess the risks and benefits with a full understanding of the impact of DLB, and to really understand the patient and caregiver perspective. So please help us get the word out. Please join us on October 15th and help make a difference. Next slide. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. We hope that maybe some of the things that we've talked about have generated some questions. If you have a question, please go to the Q&A feature. To get to that, you hover with your arrow, with your cursor at the bottom of your screen. And right about in the middle of the screen, you'll see Q&A. And if you click on that, you can type a question. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible.
Yes. So quite a few questions have been coming in. We'll try to get through as many of these as we can. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we apologize in advance. We always encourage you to reach out to LBDA with any follow-up questions after today's session. So there were a number of questions that have come in related to different personal experiences with different drugs, some drugs for Alzheimer's, and wondering whether, for example, that will become available to patients with LBD, or even experiences with therapies that perhaps in someone's experience with their mother who passed away, earlier treatment might have been beneficial, or a question about that. And so I guess the first thing I want to acknowledge is that there's many of those types of questions. We aren't going to be addressing specific medical products or giving any individual advice around treatment approaches. But what I do want to iterate is that those types of experiences that maybe have been frustrating or creating uncertainty for you around whether access to treatments, or your experiences with those treatments, or maybe even what might have been preferred to maybe improve your loved one's experiences with those treatments. Those are things that we want to hear about at the externally led PFDD meeting. As Larry just described, the whole afternoon is going to be dedicated to understanding your experiences with treatments, and that includes understanding some of the gaps and downsides, and certainly access to treatments and changing in access and treatments. One person wrote in about a black box warning being placed on a product, and that making it more difficult or reducing the amount of that product they or their loved one were able to access. If those are things that have impacted care and maybe even outcomes or your concerns for the future, we very much encourage you to join the meeting on October 15th and share some of those perspectives. There's another question. I'll pose this to Larry. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
Okay,
Yeah.
there's just one that I think I can answer a couple people's
Yep.
with this one that I thought was really important. If we register for the meeting, someone wanted to know, could but they can't attend, will they be able to see the recording? So this is for everybody. If you can't attend the meeting for whatever reason, after the meeting is over, it will be available on the same website where you registered. So the meeting will end at 3 o'clock. I think by 3:30 that afternoon, anyone in the world will be able to go. It was a public meeting. You'll be able to go to the website and watch the entire meeting. Okay. Um, and one other thing is that this is truly for everyone. Even if you've got friends that have a different diagnosis than classic dementia with Lewy bodies, they are welcome to attend and learn as well. We just ask that if you don't have dementia with Lewy bodies, that you not participate in the polling or submitting comments. We're only here to, for this meeting to learn specifically about dementia with Lewy body. So.
Yeah, so another question, Larry, maybe you can start on this one, is a question about what is a typical timeline for the full clinical development process for a potential DLB medication, probably that is learned from across drug development for many different indications. And then also there's a question of, are there any currently in the pipeline? So can you address those questions?
Sure. So as far as drug development goes, I mean, unfortunately, it's not great news. Drug development is a very labor-intensive process. So it goes through steps of trying to first find a drug that might help the disease or condition of interest. Sometimes these are brand new products being developed that have never been used for any other disease or condition. If that's the case, they have to, develop the product. Then it has to go through all those stages that James mentioned, from the early, animal testing or, working on testing the drug in test tubes, or on something new, a new technology called tissue chips that kind of simulate the liver and the kidney, organs that usually filter out drugs. So you have to do that kind of research. Then there's the steps of going into initial, human studies, and that goes through all the stages of development. Then you have to go through the approval process, and the drug has to be developed and then, ramped up to be produced in larger quantities and then marketed to the public. So this, depending upon what the drug is, it can be anywhere from 5 years to 15 years. There's a broad range, but it does take a long time. It takes a long time to produce drugs. And the other part of that question, are there drugs in development? We have an expert on the day of the meeting who's going to be giving us exactly that information, providing us with an overview of the current treatment landscape for people living with DLB. So please come and join the meeting and listen and learn. Everybody's going to learn, I think, on that day.
There's been a number of different questions. I'll try to consolidate them related to those of you that are caregivers or care partners, and whether it's appropriate for you to participate in questions, polling, the discussions, the live discussions that will happen. And the answer is yes, absolutely. So this meeting, even though we shorthand it by calling it patient-focused drug development and bringing in the patient voice, what that means is we want to hear from people who have that direct experience with the patient. And so, and not in just a clinic visit like a clinician would have, but, the other, outside of clinic visits, the other, 24/7, 365 days a year. And so for all of you that are caregivers or care partners, or, for those of you who are living with DLB that, you're wondering, should I be inviting my caregivers or care partners? The answer is absolutely yes. That does also include, I saw someone wrote in, a care partner of someone who had passed away. Absolutely, we need to hear that. We need to understand the end stage, the late stages of this disease, and you are probably best positioned to help us understand that part of the patient experience. So we wanted to make sure that that yes, we want to hear from you. There was a kind of a question of, well, are we going to be hearing from clinicians and researchers. There are parts, very short presentations as part of the meeting that's going to help educate the audience, a clinical overview and overview of the treatment landscape. But outside of that, when we get into the discussions of really understanding this condition and the unmet needs that you all have and your loved ones have, that is limited to just patients and care partners. We are not opening that up, asking other stakeholders to opine on any of those areas. So Larry, I have a question for you. There's been some questions around, are the, what different parts of what you went over are kind of still open in terms of, have you selected panelists and the Zoom participants, and what ways for people are there for people to participate that aren't in those particular spots, if you can reiterate some of that.
Sure. Yeah, just as a little background, this meeting has been underway and being planned for months and months now. There's a lot goes into, creating the meeting. So we did have to already choose the people that are going to pre-record. There were 10 individuals, selected for that. And then as far as the live people on Zoom, we also had to select those people because we're already starting to work with them. But that's just because we needed to find those people. Each and every one of you that is either living with DLB or the caregivers, care partners of any kind, all of you can attend, the polling. You will be, there's going to be a lot of polling questions throughout the meeting. So we would like to get your input on that. And then I think it's critical that when James, as he's moderating, he's going to get to a point in the meeting where he says, do we have anyone calling in to talk about what symptoms impact your life the most? So if you've called in on the day of the meeting, you'll be put into a queue, and James will try to get to as many callers as possible, and you will have an opportunity to share live on the day of the meeting. Okay, so this is something everyone can do. And then also, as people are writing in comments, like if you feel more comfortable to email a comment, we're also going to be reading those out aloud. We'll have those up on our computer screen, and we'll be able to see what people are writing about. So please take advantage of all of those things. And as I mentioned, if you send in a written comment that we don't get to during the meeting, or that you send in after the meeting, that will still be included in the Voice of the Patient report. So you all have a voice in this meeting. And part of the reason we're having this meeting, I think I said this earlier, sometimes FDA would get feedback from 1 or 2 families or a couple patients, but they knew that didn't represent the community. There are thousands of people living with DLB, and they want to hear from as many people as possible to truly understand the diversity of experience. You are not all on the same journey. Each of you have a unique journey with this illness, and we'd like to really understand that. How much variability is there in DLB? And then what's going to happen is I think themes are going to emerge. So when we start hearing all these stories, storytelling is one of the greatest ways to help people, communicate and learn. And so this is your opportunity to share your stories. And it's kind of like we're painting a picture from all these different angles. And by the end of the day, we're going to have a tremendous understanding of DLB. And I've never been to one of these meetings where even doctors that have treated many people with the condition, they think they know it all. Oh, they always say at the end of the meeting, you know something? I never appreciated X, Y, and Z, or I never really understood what patients go through with this one symptom or something like that. So everybody's going to learn if you participate. We really need participation. So,
yeah. So again, great. A lot of questions coming in. We'll keep working through these. This is great. So there's been a couple of questions that relate to what types of products FDA regulates. One is, is FDA involved in improving testing for diagnosis? Another was, what about non-traditional drugs? What about bone marrow stem cells? And so the answers to those questions is yes. So FDA, we again kind of shorthand a little bit when we do these presentations, but FDA does regulate a wide range of medical products. It does regulate diagnostic products. Those fall under its device regulatory authority. So FDA regulates medical devices, including diagnostics. So your experiences relating to, testing for diagnosis, are relevant to that part of FDA. And then, yes, whether, it's stem cells or other types of cell therapies are regulated as biologics. I had mentioned biologics license application being one of the paths to approval. And so those do also fall under FDA's regulatory authority, just so everyone knows that. A question for Larry, just one second, scrolling down here. There was a question about, for people who can't attend the meeting live, can we, are they still able to participate in any of the input as part of the day?
Yeah, so the only input, if you can't attend live, you won't be able to do the call-in portion of the meeting, but you will be able to take advantage of the written response, sending in emails with your comments, and you'll be able to see what some of the questions, and you'll be able to watch the meeting. So hopefully that will guide you in what you decide to contribute via writing, okay? And there was another point that someone brought up that I thought was really important, that one of the things that FDA really wants, as well as us, to emphasize diversity within your community. This includes gender diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, age diversity. We want young and old, diversity of every kind. And that has been part of our planning of this meeting. We're trying our best to be inclusive. So yeah, that's something that that's actually really important to the outcome, because everyone doesn't have this, like I said earlier, everybody doesn't have the same experience. So we want to try to capture that as much as possible. And then one other thing I wanted to address, someone said, that we've come up with the questions ahead of time, which they thought might be a limitation, I think. But during the live discussion, it can go anywhere. So those questions that we've submit, have like what symptoms are important. That's a jumping off point. But then as James is moderating, he's going to be getting into a discussion with the people that are there, and a live discussion with the callers. So we don't know what's going to happen. We never know what's going to happen until the day of the meeting, because it's up to you and what kind of input you bring to the meeting.
Yeah. So there's been a few follow-up questions asking, well, how do I submit those written comments? And so I know we've used the term email. It's actually going to be a web form that lives on the patient-focused drug development webpage on the current externally led PFDD web page on the website. So closer to the meeting, that will be added, and we can make sure that everybody gets an announcement for when that's made live. And so, as soon as that goes live, whether or not you're participating in the actual meeting day, go ahead and submit early comments. That helps us, start collecting those early, a little early in the process. And that even if you submit a written comment, you absolutely can still be calling in, answering the polling questions on the live meeting day. So don't think, oh, I've already given my input. I shouldn't be kind of raising my virtual hand. No, please do still feel free to participate live. A couple of questions have come. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
I was just going to say, yeah, I was reviewing a few of the questions that had a little bit similar content. And some of you had some specifics about either a drug trial that you're currently in or interested in participating, or about specific drugs, or about the design of specific clinical trials. We are not going to be able to, discuss those kinds of things during the meeting. That's not the purpose of this particular meeting. Although they're all important questions, but just not for this particular meeting.
But what I will say on the point of clinical trials is, it may not be obvious, but we do want to hear about your experiences with clinical trials as part of this meeting. We understand when there's a great unmet need, people turn to clinical trials to supplement what's approved either on or off label. And so, I saw some of the questions were about being denied from participating in clinical trials. Others were talking about the success that they had in clinical trials. That is all part of that kind of treatment landscape that we want to hear about. What were your experiences, in those trials, just like when you're talking about your experiences with other types of treatment approaches.
I think we've reached the end of our time. So I want to thank James and Larry, and thank you all for attending. Please share this link, share the information, as many people and as many voices as we can have attending on October 15th. And please feel free to contact us at LBDA for other questions about Lewy body dementia and how we can help support you. Thank you, everybody.